There was this lonely gravel road that I ended up referring to simply as the shortcut, having only discovered its whereabouts whilst attempting to halve my journey time to work. The winding road was so remote, most modern maps wouldn't plot it, and was completely overlooked except for a few local farmers utilizing the road to access crops. This particular patch of southwest England was both scenic and barren, with insignificant village after village appearing around each twist and turn. Often I'd emerge from a night shift, dreary-eyed and in need of rest. The lay-by on the secluded road was my go-to. I didn't mind the missing streetlights, as the pitch black only aided in my roadside nap. Besides, I could always use my van's headlights if needed. They offered more than enough visibility. The lay-by itself was stretched thin, being only just wide enough for my van to sit comfortably. The neighboring hedgerows were shoddy at best, with many gaping holes giving access to the fields beyond. At the far end sits a rusty gate leading to another overgrown field, its disuse clearly marked with a length of chain coiled around the post holding it shut. The ground of this rural retreat was never an issue for me either, despite its muddy surface. It had its potholes, sure, but I had my van. I've had it for almost 2 years now. We've traveled the length of the country together. It's always been both sturdy and reliable, and it hasn't failed me yet. That night after my shift ended, I pulled up, slowing my speed right down to an almost walking pace. Hearing the vehicle start to groan as we'd leave the road behind, the carriage rocked in slow motion, while splashes of cold brown squalor coated the van's underside. I noticed the crescent moon returned into view, though its pale glow was obscured by wispy clouds. Rain was beginning to look more and more likely. I eased down on the brakes as I came to a final stop, pulling up on the handbrake whilst leaving the engine to steadily tick over. I decided to make use of my dipped headlights for peace of mind, revealing most of the area ahead in a dirty yellow hue. I got out of the vehicle, avoiding the potholes as best I could. I steadily walked to the rear of the van, listening as the hedgerows bustled with various birds and crickets. I let out a terrible whistling noise, unable to hold a decent tune if my life depended on it. My hands clasped the back door before pulling them open, greeted by a smaller somber yellow light that flickered within the interior. It remained unseen from the driver's perspective, hidden behind a thick plastic wall that divided the vehicle. I tossed my stained overalls into a messy pile, then swapped my boots for my old tattered trainers. I always made a point of cleaning what tools I had used that night, placing them back within their designated tool bag before slamming the doors shut. I was most relieved to be done with my work for another night. On my way back around the van, I paused, looking up to admire the night sky, gazing between the breaks of clouds. The distant lack of light pollution gave way to an abundance of stars. I often imagined them as silver pinpricks upon a blackened canvas. I smiled wearily at that thought, continuing to walk on as I kicked a couple of loose stones. They'd vanished within a pool of muddy water. I gave a last look towards my surroundings as I moved around the front of the vehicle. I realized then that I'd never actually seen this particular area in broad daylight. I felt cheated, wishing to have been able to witness the picturesque views that would surely come in abundance here. But I guess for me, the lay-by only ever meant darkness. Just as I turned to make my way back to the driver's side door, something became apparent in my peripheral vision, something I had failed to notice up until now. It was made just about visible within the stranded reaches of the headlights. Near the gate at the far end of the lay-by. Whatever it was, I didn't recall it being there last night. "The hell?" I muttered. It looked like a slender container, far taller than me, even at this distance. Intrigued, I approached, casting a long shadow in the light of my making, watching my footing as this mysterious object inched further into view. Preston's Loo Hire Limited. I read aloud, sounding a little dumbfounded. The words scribbled in chunky black marker upon the plastic door. It was a portaloo of all things. Its overall green and yellow coloring scheme seemed aged and grimy, not to mention tacky. I glanced down, 4 large breeze blocks propped in each corner, seemingly keeping the whole thing from sinking. My eyes noticed a large red lifting strap abandoned in the mud nearby. I assumed whoever placed this here must have done so in the last few hours. Well, since it was here, I thought that I'd pay it a flying visit. I hadn't noticed anything to presume it was off limits, locked, or otherwise out of order. I figured, since I hadn't had the time earlier in my shift, that now was as good a time as any. However, I soon turned up my nose in disgust. Now just a foot away from the door, the horrid stench of the toilet filled my nostrils. The hazardous cocktail of bodily fluid and blue biocide lingered heavily in the air. Just then a strange feeling swept over me. I don't know why, I couldn't quite place it. This all just deep down felt a little wrong. My hand still outstretched, though I asked myself again if I really wanted to go in there. Apparently I did. I grasped the handle, still better than the toilet at the festivals, I scoffed, masking my apparent nerves with a little humor. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for whatever lay beyond the door. I then pulled at it. It creaked as it began to open, only for my arm to stiffen as the movement unexpectedly stopped. It became stuck by an unknown force. The small slit in the door released a couple of trapped flies, whilst the putrid air seeped out, stinging both my eyes and nostrils. Jesus, I spluttered, dry heaving before pulling my shirt up and over my mouth and nose. I tried again with minimal effort. The want of actually using it had faded. I just couldn't admit defeat. The door didn't budge, but then I noticed something particular about the handle. In the light of my van, I noticed it was shown as occupied. Though it was hard to tell, the coloring looked completely faded, teetering on the cusp of being vacant. Hello? Is someone in here? I spoke, my voice sounding far more anxious than perhaps I wanted. I even knocked a couple of times just to be polite, but there was no response. Before an insistent reminder crossed my mind and legs. Turning, I went to water the hedgerow instead. The novelty toilet having left me with mixed emotions. Likely for the best, I thought. The smell was foul enough, even from the outside. I soon finished, buttoning up my trousers, hearing it clatter as I lifted my foot. It was a grime-covered padlock, forcefully splayed open and glinting in the dirt. I moved its broken parts carelessly with my trainer before stepping over it. I did gaze back at the portaloo, but quickly disregarded it, believing it to have been more than likely belonging to the gate just beyond. I promptly returned to my van after that, as the gentle rumble of the idle engine lulled me into a sense of security. I thought I'd finished the rest of my lunch, whilst turning on the radio for company. It was a local station. It only seemed to play old songs, but I didn't mind. It had a habit of losing signal though, but I chalked that up to be my current location. Checking my phone, I noticed it dropped in and out of signal also, rolling my eyes at that. I plugged it into a charger nevertheless, tossing it carelessly onto the passenger seat. I took a bite from my sandwich as I glanced at the portaloo down the way. Bloody thing, I said with a mouthful of sarnie, shaking my head. I leaned back further into my seat, taking another few bites from my lunch before placing it down on the dash in front. A couple of songs had played before I was startled by a presence. It was slender and red. I watched as it left the hedgerow, creeping into my headlights. A fox. It skulked with purpose. It spared a glance towards me and my van, its beady eyes reflected in the light. I gradually winded down my driver's side window, tossing out a few leftover scraps of my lunch. My presence wasn't enough to spook it, however, but it kept its distance despite the food that I offered. I leant forward, crossing my arms upon the steering wheel as I observed it some more. The fox had finally noticed the portaloo just as I had. It slinked closer to investigate it further. "You'll have to use the hedge like everyone else," I shouted out the window to it, chuckling to myself at that. I looked on as the fox lifted itself up and pressed its front paws upon the button of the door. From a distance, it looked like it was scratching at it, as if it wanted to be let in. Between the music of the radio and the sound of my engine, I didn't hear what made it suddenly yelp and jump with fright, appearing to me utterly unprovoked. It just looked alert and terrified, my attention fixated as its body turned away, Its hair prickled high along its spine. I furrowed my brow as I saw no obvious reason for the animal's current distress. I glanced between itself and the portaloo door, but the fox ran off soon after, obscuring itself within the twilight of the night. The bloody hell? What was that all about? I thought, before realizing I was now sitting bolt upright. My unsteadiness continued as I observed the toilet again, puzzled by these strange occurrences. Though as strange and thought-provoking as it was, I couldn't hold off the Sandman for much longer. I felt the weight of my drowsy eyes peering at the radio again. The analog clock showed 4:20 a.m. I yawned quietly, leaning my head back against the headrest. I didn't much like the idea of any poor animal trapped inside that nasty thing, but I figured I hadn't heard anything, or that there must have been a hole or something at the rear, agreeing with myself to have another nose around before leaving just in case. I raised my window back up to around the halfway mark before slowly succumbing to a much-needed rest. I didn't dream, however, recalling only a calming voice as I slipped away into an ever-deepening slumber. I awoke suddenly to a muffled bang, partnered with what I felt like was the van's suspension bobbing. I could only half acknowledge it given my state, but it was more than enough to wake me. Whatever it was partially distorted by a crappy 80s ballad still blaring on the radio. My eyes groggy as I hazily turned my head to check the time. It was 4:32 a.m. I sat up further, rubbing the minimal sleep from my eyes as I gradually started to make sense of my surroundings. Noticeable foremost, upon my dashboard ahead, a distant red light now on display, the crimson warning icon of a door having not been shut correctly. Confusion overcame me as I quickly sought to make sense of the situation, opening my driver's side door before promptly closing it again. To my growing anxiety, the warning light persisted. I could have sworn blind that I had shut the back doors, slammed them even, but there it was, staring at me in the face, now open somehow. I'd quickly looked to my right and left wing mirrors, squinting as I'm unable to see the white of the open doors against the dark backdrop. Knowing now that it could only have been left open slightly, what I saw next made my mouth turn dry. The portaloo, that damned green and yellow box from down the lay-by, it had opened a little, where only moments prior it insisted to remain closed. The rational part of my brain scurried to the forefront. I must have loosened it. Perhaps the wind had a strong part to play. Perhaps whatever critter that spooked the fox earlier finally nudged its way out. I didn't want to believe anything else, but the sense of building dread began to eat away at me. I sat there, unaware of my knuckles turning white as I gripped the steering wheel. But despite everything, there was only one question on my mind. Is there something in the back of my van? That thought made my blood run cold. Horrific images started to flood my mind. Faceless monsters crouched in wait, thinking that they'd intrude quietly enough to surprise me later on. Knowing whatever it was only obscured to me now by that thick plastic wall. I immediately silenced the radio, perking my ears as I adjusted my body to listen. I began to hear things, whether it was my mind creating false sounds through sheer terror or the sobering reality of the situation. There were low mutterings between raspy breaths. The presence was unnerving. It steadily became louder, as if its face was pressed hard against the plastic divide. The sudden loud sound of the van horn broke my trance. Cursing as I lifted my elbow from the center of the steering wheel, I exhaled heavily while staring back towards the divider. Though to my surprise, the fear that gripped me before now started to subside, replaced by small bouts of senseless courage, a stronger part of me that wanted this whole ordeal to be over with. The part of my mind that remained rational and determined, doing all it could to stave off the lurking monsters of my vivid imagination, transforming them back into nothing more than overtiredness and a crappy toilet door. What's up with all these stupid doors tonight? I scowled. I'd start to become irritated by this point, but I fully realized what I was getting myself in for. I found myself standing just outside the van, night air brisk against my flesh. I felt a shiver crawl over me, and not just from the drop in temperature. There was a strange atmosphere now about the lay-by. It was incredibly quiet aside the van, with a faint scent now present that seemed familiar somehow. Nevertheless, I carried on with one carefully pressed foot in front of the other. The idle engine helped to disguise my footfalls upon the mud. Before long, I found myself confronting the culprit, the very thing that set my dashboard aglow. In the blackness, I could see that the left door had been pulled open, as was the right, however slightly. This allowed a thin line of yellow light to shine through against my body. I closed my eyes at this point, my heart ready to burst from my chest. Giving in to my most primal fears, there was nothing in there. I started mustering what courage I had left. As if attempting a singular final act of bravery, I grabbed both handles and pulled them asunder, my head turning away as I did, gritting my teeth as if resigning myself to a grisly fate. It never came. I opened my eyes to find that I was alone, standing there at the rear end of my tool-laden van. The exhaust fumes felt inconsistent, but warm against my legs. I felt the fool. I attempted a sigh, but somehow splurted a genuine laugh. How could I have been that stupid? The fear all seemed so distant now, replaced by the urge to forget this ever happened. I closed the right door first, shaking my head with a plastered grin on my face before I finally felt it. Both my palms were sticky. I narrowed my gaze and offered them both up to the only light available. They were caked in a dark blue substance. More than that, in fact. It was tingling against my skin. I offered my left hand closer to my nose before inhaling a fragrant scent of something now all too familiar. I gasped in my renewed horror. My eyes widened as the distance I stumbled from the van revealed even more to me. With the aid of the pathetic light through the now open doors, I could see streaks of massive blue swipes all across the white of the back doors. They looked utterly deformed, both exaggerated and spindly, as if whatever these grotesque hands belonged to seemingly enjoyed fondling the rear of my vehicle, searching tirelessly for those ever-elusive handles, which surely enough they found. I cried out as I slammed the door shut, unaware how fast my breathing began to shallow, my heart now thumping in my ears as my pulse heightened. In my panicked frenzy, I slipped and fell hard, my face submerged into one of the freezing waterlogged potholes. Rising back up with a cold gasp for air, I proceeded to crawl with my eyes half shut, sliding and struggling along my belly. I felt a sinister presence now, watching me in my attempts to flee. I'm crying as I grasp helplessly for the handle, pulling myself back into the safety of the driver's seat. Using the inside of my jumper, I quickly wiped the mud from my face and eyes, feeling a few terrified tears slide down my icy cheeks. My hands felt like they were barely my own, but I didn't wait. With my breathing still fleeting, I forcefully engaged the clutch before I threw the van into first gear, preparing to sacrifice all of the tires just to be free of this dreadful place. But for all my frantic effort, nothing had happened. The engine was quiet as the van remained dormant. Cursing under bated breath, or in my haste I had failed to even acknowledge it. It's off. The engine, I whimpered, thinking back to a moment ago when I felt the fumes of the exhaust brush my legs. I then swallowed hard at that thought, letting out a soft moan as I finally understood the horrific severity of it all. Whatever had come out of the toilet, it never wanted anything from the back of my van. It just wanted me out of it. It was underneath me all along, underneath the van, biding its time. I confirmed my sickening theory quick enough. My numb hands felt around the ignition for the keys, but they were gone. I scoured for other items such as my phone and food, but it was all now missing. I foolishly left the window open. The smell had followed me, now pungent within the small caddy, clinging to the interior like flies to rotten meat. I felt like retching as I finally noticed the handprints that started from my driver's side window. Its slimy hand had slipped in, creeping its way through my belongings like a thief in the night. Its arm had to have been a few feet in length, whilst freakishly thin enough to slide through the gape in the window. Though whatever it was, it allowed me to keep the headlight switched on. I imagined this only as some twisted sense of humor. I gathered my senses before winding up the rest of the window. I then leaned across with urgency to finally lock both doors manually. I'm frightfully aware that such an initiative came all too late on my part. And for my idiocy, I'm now trapped within the shell of both metal and rubber, fearing I'm soon to pay the price for my mistake. All I could do was just stare ahead helplessly, through the windscreen towards that sadistic yellow and green portaloo, kept alight in the beams. "Leave me alone!" I cried out in despair, my voice losing its resilience, reverting to yet another pathetic weep. As I continued to glare, the interior of the portaloo became a little more apparent, whilst my eyes slowly began to adjust. There was no seat, not anymore anyway. The hardened plastic bench where it once sat looked torn asunder, revealing a gaping pit down into the bowels of the septic tank. The 4 interior walls, smattered with the blue blood of the toilet, stained black from the copious amount. This was the festering home of my unknown tormentor. The lack of distraction and noise now allowed me to hear its movements more clearly. I envisioned it now crawling along the underside of the van, clinging like a plump spider to the framework. It was still there. I could hear it skittering and writhing. The lamps of the headlights didn't illuminate the side windows well, but the quick passing of shadowy limbs only added to my paranoia. I was the juicy insect trapped within its metal web. I did the only thing I could do. I began to make myself smaller, lowering my body upon the seats. I even went as far as stuffing my frame down into the passenger footwell. I pulled my large jacket closed, praying that this hellish stalker lost interest in me. I don't recall how long I waited like that. The minutes dragged on indefinitely as my limbs ached and numbed from my awkward position. It was then that I heard the forecasted rain started up again. Large droplets fell as they began to pitter-patter against the roof and windows surrounding me. I laid there, frozen in complete dread as the unspeakable began to happen. A sound incoherent to the rain, looking ahead as it came from the driver's side window. My stomach twisted in knots as a pair of extremely long, freakish fingers walked up the driver's side window from below. As if they were taking a horizontal stroll, I could see the gnarled flesh stained blue and the nails crooked and sharp against the glass. They began to tap ghoulishly, playful in nature, as if dancing to a ghastly rhythm. I shot a gaze directly above me as a secondary pair of dancing digits started climbing, intruding upon the passenger's window now too. I watched through watery eyes as they danced their disjointed dance around me, keeping in unison with their partner on the opposite side. The unknown conductor of this devilish routine was showing off the full reach of its gangly limbs. The rain became a heavy constant, and I was left burdened with the understanding that this creature had no intentions of leaving me alone. I blinked as the bony fingers had vanished. Their dance had come to an abrupt end. I watched with nauseating anticipation as the now heavy downpour quietly replaced them, each drop racing the next aimlessly down the glass. My respite was painfully brief, hearing something feel and slither behind my head. Before I could turn to look once more, both the doors simultaneously tried to open. My demonic pursuer attempted a second time, then a third. Its persistence felt encouraged by a growing hunger. I cried aloud, though I counted my blessings that my van's stoic locks held true. The fingers returned with a vengeance, now as full emaciated palms, slapping wet upon both windows. I could see now the full extent of these 5-fingered snatchers. My mind tried to register them as something human, but all 5 fingers matched in length, thin and knobby at each joint, easily the length of the window it now holds. I could hear the glass begin to crack as its grip tightened. It began to sway the entire van back and forth in building frustration. I begged for the insanity to stop before covering my face fully with my jacket. "Go away, please! Oh God!" I bleated like trapped prey. I could hear the creeping figure start to move out from under me as the van shifted with the added weight. It no longer felt the need to confine itself to the muddy floor. I could hear it clamoring high as it investigated the vehicle from the roof now. It wasn't long before I sensed a pair of evil eyes now upon me. As I cowered uncontrollably below it, there was no longer any noise beside the rain. I imagined it was staring at me closely through the window. In fact, I just knew it was. Its eyes piercing the very fabric covering my face. I then heard the subtle squeaking sounds, as if a wet sponge was being pulled across a smooth surface. I envisioned its horrific figures now sliding up and down the window, a terrible mouth grinning wide with equally terrible teeth and tongue. I continued to imagine its immense excitement in watching me squirm deliciously within. But that wasn't the worst of it. It spoke.
"Hello? Is there anyone in here?"
An utterly deranged, mocking voice hissed from behind the glass. I blacked out after hearing that. My body crumbled under the last dose of injected fear. Time surely passed, and I slowly came to. I didn't hear or feel any sign from my tormentor for quite a while after that. The rain had also started to diminish. I was both physically and emotionally exhausted. I pulled back the jacket from over my head. It revealed to me a frantic trail of blue handprints that scaled across almost every inch of my van's exterior. I noticed the cracks that began to form upon some of the glass edges, knowing they wouldn't withstand another of the creature's onslaught. There was also a long streak of visibility to the outside. It stretched almost the entire expanse of the windscreen, right between the brown and blue mess, as if made purposely for my viewing. I shuddered as it looked like it had been created by delirious licking. Through the slick of the windscreen, I squinted. Within the headlights, something was sticking up a few feet ahead. Upon an upright stick, reflected back a hanging set of keys. They were my keys. Of course they were. Beyond that, I noticed the tracks of biocide that slunk back behind the portaloo door. It seemed closed, or at least that's what it wanted me to think. I could see it being held ajar by a single terribly long finger. I quietly pleaded for daybreak to arrive, but I fear that the thing won't wait that long. In fact, I'm sure of it. I can see the portaloo door swaying. It wasn't done toying with me, and all it had to do was wait for me to attempt the unthinkable. I'll soon have no choice but to play its cruel game. I have to get out of here. I have to try.